He was an Ohio judge whose intellectual prowess won him the admiration of presidents and seats in their administrations. But William Howard Taft didn't much care for politics and never wanted the presidency himself, aspiring instead to the Supreme Court.
Don't sit up nights thinking about making me president, for that will never come, and I have no ambition in that direction. Any party which would nominate me would make a great mistake.
Taft would have both jobs before his career was over, however, joining the High Court 8 years after his single term in the White House.
It's very difficult for me to understand how a man who is so good as Chief Justice could have been so bad as President. Justice Louis Brandeis.
Taft's 1908 presidential bid was inspired less by his own ambition than by the enthusiasm of his wife, Nellie, who liked the idea of moving her family to the White House. Also a key factor was the backing of his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, who after declining a second full term became Taft's most ardent supporter in hopes that Taft would carry on the Roosevelt legacy. Such prospects troubled Taft. As a public servant, he was more comfortable taking orders than giving them, having excelled as Roosevelt's war secretary and before that as Governor General of the Philippines under William McKinley. He was also more of a lawyer than a politician and hoped to resume the brilliant legal career he'd forged after graduating from Cincinnati Law School in 1880. Taft had been U.S. Solicitor General at age 32 and a federal judge a year after that. Still, Taft couldn't say no to Roosevelt and his wife both, and in 1908 cast aside his chosen career to run for high office. Winning largely on a promise to continue Roosevelt's policies, he and running mate James Sherman assumed office in March of 1909. Once in the White House, however, the new president was instantly ill at ease.
When I hear someone say, "Mr. President," I look around expecting to see Roosevelt.
But if Taft had to adjust to the presidency, America had to adjust to Taft as well. The new chief executive couldn't have differed more from the flamboyant Roosevelt. The leisurely, relaxed Taft routinely fell asleep in public places, and at 330 pounds was also the heaviest president the nation had known. He reportedly once got stuck in the White House bathtub, requiring the subsequent installation of a special model large enough to accommodate 4 men. But Taft also helped define our modern-day idea of the presidency. He was the first chief executive to take up golf, as well as to own an automobile, converting the White House stables into a 4-car garage. He visited Mexico in 1909 on what was one of the first presidential visits to a foreign country. And in 1910, he became the first president to throw out the first pitch at a baseball game. His wife made Washington history herself when she arranged for the planting of 3,000 cherry trees around the city's tidal basin. She was also the first presidential spouse to sit beside her husband in the inaugural parade. The Tafts generated little popular excitement, however, and though Taft was a successful trust buster and continued his predecessor's campaign to conserve natural resources, his lackluster administration disappointed his former mentor, who soon became Taft's staunchest critic. Calling his protege a fathead, Roosevelt challenged Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912, going on to run as a third-party candidate. The subsequent split of the Republican base helped ensure Woodrow Wilson's victory, whereupon Taft remarked, "I'm glad to be going. This is the lonesomest place in the world." After the presidency, Taft taught law at Yale, his alma mater, for 8 years before President Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the United States in 1921. He served on the Supreme Court until just before his death in 1930. His years on the bench were his happiest.
The truth is that in my present life, I don't remember that I ever was president.
Taft died in Washington, D.C. on March 8, 1930, at age 72.
The truth is, we've got to wake up in this country. We are not all there is in the world. There are lots besides us, and there are lots of people besides us that are entitled to our effort and our money and our sacrifice to help them on in the world.
This is the Mount Auburn area of Cincinnati, not far from downtown. About 20 minutes from the airport, 10 minutes from the stadium where the Cincinnati Reds play. And this was the home of William Howard Taft, our 27th president and our 10th Supreme Court Chief Justice, the only man to hold both offices. Taft was born in this house in 1857, and he grew up here. Here you can see him at age 11. He lived in this house with his father, Alfonso, who was a member of President Grant's cabinet, his mother, Louise, and several of his brothers and sisters. And he would live here until 1874 when he left to attend Yale. Today, this home is a National Historic Site run by the National Park Service. Superintendent Kurt Topham and Chief of Interpretation Ray Henderson will show us around. Taft scholar David Burton provides the historical context. Of course, we will take your phone calls, and you can start dialing now if you like. And later, we're going to meet the president's great-grandson, William Howard Taft IV. He'll talk about this family, which besides President Taft, has included congressmen, senators, mayors, and the current governor of the state, Bob Taft. We are in the parlor of the Taft home. David Burton, I have two quotes from President William Howard Taft. One is, "Politics, when I'm in it, makes me sick." And the second one is, "A national campaign for the presidency is, to me, a nightmare." How did a man who said these things get to be president of the United States?
Sometimes quotations like this are taken out of context. Sometimes they're said privately for non-public consumption. I think that Taft was, in some sense, torn between duty and his own personal preferences. And therefore, these are, I would think, off-the-cuff remarks which have to be contextualized whenever they are offered and to whomever they are offered.
Kurt Topham, what did he look like?
He was a large man. He was about 6 foot tall. At one point, he rose to the weight of about 330 pounds. So he was an impressive man. He was referred to as Big Lub when he was a child.
How did he get that nickname?
He was always a big child.
And what about the handlebar mustache? Was that popular at the time?
It was. Many individuals had the handlebar mustaches.
We also can listen to a little bit of what he sounded like at the time. And this is when he was talking, I think, let's see, he was talking on August 25th, 1908, about how countries must work together out their differences through diplomacy, not war.
Of every civilized man, that war should be abolished, and that the suffering, cruelty, corruption, and demoralization that follow in its train should be, as far as we can bring it about, lifted as a burden from the human race. It is our duty to take every legitimate and proper step we can to persuade the nations of the world to settle their controversies in some other way.
What was his presentation like?
I think his presentation was a formal one. He was a formal man. I picked up a couple of parts of his diction there, which led me to believe that he was a sober judge, and therefore his presentations were not matter of fact so much as they were intended to be earnest.
Kurt Topham, we mentioned we were in the Mount Auburn area of Cincinnati. What is this area?
This area is a hill up above the downtown area of Cincinnati, and probably the first area that the downtown area migrated to in terms of a suburban neighborhood. It was an affluent neighborhood, and the people began migrating up out of the dirty air and terrible conditions on the riverside in the 1820s and 30s.
Who built this house?
The house was built in 1840. The house was actually purchased by Alfonso Taft, William Howard's father, in 1851.
We mentioned that William Howard Taft was born in this house then 6 years later. This is in 1857. This is the parlor that we're sitting in. What happened here?
This was a formal room. The Tafts used it, but very sparingly. It was normally used for special events, birthday parties, dances. There were a number of funerals that were held in this room, card parties, things of that nature. But it was not really used by the family as a family room would be today.
Where are we at in terms of geography of the state? Where is Cincinnati?
We are in the southwest corner of the state, right where Ohio joins with Indiana and Kentucky, right on the Ohio River.
And how did the family get here?
Alfonso came to Cincinnati out of law school. He had been looking for a place to move to begin his practice as an attorney, and felt that the western edge of civilization was Cincinnati. He found it to be a very good spot to begin his family, and moved to Cincinnati with that in mind.
Kurt Topham is the superintendent of the National Park Service here at this site. David Burton is a professor. You teach at what college?
At St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia.
And how did you get involved with William Howard Taft?
It is ironic that I got involved with William Howard Taft because I was originally involved with Theodore Roosevelt. But Taft struck me early on as perhaps a neglected president, and I continued to neglect him for some years. But I did a book called The Learned Presidency. There was plenty of material on Roosevelt and Wilson, not enough on Taft. I had to do some digging, and the digging got me interested in Taft's legal mind and his political philosophy, and then a biography, and then a special study on Taft and the court, and now I hope the collected works of William Howard Taft.
And you wrote this book?
Yes, I did.
Is it still available? Can one buy this?
It is available, yes. It's published by Krieger Company, and it's available for what I think is a very fair price, if I may plug it in that way.
Chicago, your first stop. Good morning.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for this wonderful series. I had a couple of questions regarding Taft as a Supreme Court justice. I understand that he played a key role in the building of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to know where did the Supreme Court meet before the justices had their own building, and what did Taft do to influence its construction? And I had one more question. I'd like to know what, in your opinion, was the most significant Supreme Court case that Taft presided over, and why?
Professor Burton.
Thank you for those two very interesting and evocative questions. The Supreme Court met in the basement of the Capitol, as it were, under the great rotunda, and therefore it stood between the two houses of the legislature, something which William Howard Taft was not keen on. He thought that the Supreme Court deserved its own premises, if we may speak of that court building as a premise, his own premises, its own premises, and therefore he lobbied the Congress. He lobbied the Congress very, very strongly in order to get the funds necessary to have this designed and then built, and alas, as often happens, his dream was realized, but he did not live long enough to see the building constructed. Insofar as his most important decision, having been president, I would tend to focus on Myers versus the United States, in which he insisted that the president had the power to dismiss a civil servant, even though that civil servant had to be approved by the Senate. So he was saying, I'll take the senatorial approval, but I do not need the Senate's approval to dismiss such a person. In this case, alas, a fourth-class postmaster.
Hattiesburg, Mississippi, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. Sir, I'm an Afro-American historian. My thesis will be to parallel African-American history from the Reconstruction era to the present. My two questions are these, sir. The Hanna machine in the presidential election of the Republican Party. As you know, the Southern Republican Party was destroyed by the purchase of black voters. And Hanna brought in the blacks who controls this machine and said that he will maintain the support of them. And one of the key reasons that Roosevelt did not receive the nomination was that he controlled the black vote in the Republican convention. That lasted until Eisenhower, which eliminated. What role did black politicians in the South play in the presidential nomination of the Republican Party? Second question is this, sir. Do you think that there should be a parallel history of American black history with American history from the Reconstruction era to the period to give a balanced point of view of American history?
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a little bit unclear on what election you referred to when you referred to Theodore Roosevelt, so I'll try to answer your general question, and that is that the efforts of all the Republicans, including the leadership of Mark Hanna, strove to try to win black votes in the name of Abraham Lincoln, if you will, but were not terribly successful because they did not look upon the black vote component as a swing vote in at least very many communities. The other question, of course there should be an effort on the part of someone, perhaps like yourself, to do this parallel history in order to get balance. My own view, however, is that that ought to be interwoven with the history of the United States, the political history of the United States, if you will, the socioeconomic history of the United States, if you will, should be woven together, because it's only in this way that the black vote enters the mainstream.
Kurt Topham, how long has this site been a National Park Service site?
This was established by an act of Congress in 1969, so this year's our 30th birthday.
How many rooms in this house?
It has 4 main rooms on the ground floor and 4 main rooms on the top floor, and then a couple of rooms in the basement.
As we said, we're in the parlor area. We're going to show our viewers that we're going to go all the way to the back of the house now, where you have some exhibits set up. We can see some photos.
That's correct.
All the way back into the back of the room we have joining us is Ray Henderson. Ray Henderson is the Chief of Interpretation for this house. Good morning, Mr. Henderson.
Good morning. Excuse me, good morning.
What do you like about these pictures that are next to you of the young Will?
Well, I think, William Howard Taft had a happy life growing up here, and he grew up in a household where his parents expected a lot from him. They were all well educated, and they expected those things from their children. William Howard Taft was a hard worker, not particularly the brightest of the children, but he worked hard, and he always accomplished a lot when he went through school.
Did he have a fun childhood?
Yes, he had a fun childhood here in Mount Auburn. On the hillsides, they sled on the hills in the wintertime. When the canal ran through Cincinnati and it froze over in the winter, they'd skate on it, and then they would swim in the summertime.
Now we're going to learn a little bit about his family in that room. Who were his brothers and sisters, and who did we meet?
Well, William Howard Taft had 2 older brothers, 2 older half-brothers, Peter Rawson and Charles Phelps. And he had 2 younger brothers, Henry Waters Taft and Horace Dutton Taft. They were all high achievers. They were a very close family, and they were helpful throughout all of William Howard Taft's career, especially Charles Phelps Taft, who helped because he married a woman who in 1900 inherited $15 million. And he used that money as well as his business sense to help William Howard Taft, especially when he was running for president and in some of the positions that he held.
I think Charles Taft is I don't know if we can go back to that picture. Charles Taft is the second one from the right. Is that correct?
That is correct.
With the white beard. David Burton, would William Howard Taft have become president of the United States if Charles Taft had not financially helped him over the years?
Simple answer, yes. Should I elaborate?
Please.
Well, Theodore Roosevelt wanted him to be president. Theodore Roosevelt had forsworn the presidency in 1908, back in 1904, foolishly as some people said, and therefore he wanted Taft. He trusted Taft. Taft was an excellent Secretary of War. He was diplomat on mission. He believed in what Roosevelt believed in, and he continued to believe in what Roosevelt believed in once he became president. That is to say, he was practicing moderate progressivism. So there's no question and doubt in my mind that Charles Taft had something to do with it, but he was not the key player. He did not really have the political weight that Roosevelt had, and Roosevelt was willing to throw into the race.
Kurt Topham, on the wall of the room back there, we have a portrait of Alphonso Taft, President Taft's father. What influence did Alphonso Taft play in William Howard Taft's life?
Alphonso, as Ray said earlier, demanded a lot from his children. He was a very good role model. He was an attorney. He was known for his honesty, for his public service, and he demanded that out of his children.
He was a Secretary of War professor, is that correct? In the
He was Attorney General,
Secretary
of War.
In the Ulysses S. Grant
Right,
administration.
and also Minister to Vienna and to St. Petersburg at one time or another.
Did William Howard Taft as a child ever accompany his father in any of these?
No, he did not.
Looking back again, going through the family, we have some photos here of some of the brothers and sisters. Ray Henderson, who are these people?
Here on the right is Horace Dutton Taft. He moved into education, founding the Taft School in Watertown, Connecticut, where William Howard Taft's two sons went to school. His brother Charlie, his brother Henry Waters Taft down here, who was a corporate lawyer in New York, and Peter Rawson Taft, who died at an early age, who was also an attorney. And here we have William Howard Taft's sister, Frances Taft Edwards, also known as Fanny.
And she was the only a female in the bunch?
Yes, she was the only surviving female of Alfonso's children.
And going a little bit further, we get to meet his mother. Ray Henderson, what was his mother like?
His mother was, was what we like to say was typical of the Taft women, very strong, very well educated, and she enjoyed being the wife of Alfonso Taft. She had a lot of influence on her son, and there's a great quote here where she says that no Taft, to my knowledge, has ever yet neglected a public duty for the sake of gratifying a private desire. And that was on William Howard Taft's 1907 trip around the world. He left even though his mother was sick, and he never got to see her again. And she was one of those people that made sure that her children were duty bound.
Ray Henderson's Ray, you're going to keep on moving here and go on into the library. We'll see you in just a few minutes in there. On the way to the library, our cameras are going to stop in a little for just a few minutes so we can show our viewers the nursery, which was the nursery room of William Howard Taft, our 27th president, as we take a call from Laguna Woods, California. Good morning, Laguna Woods.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Mr. Taft served as Governor General of the Philippines from 1901 to 1904. My late father-in-law, George A. Malcolm, arrived in the Philippines in 1906, and in 1917 was appointed to the Supreme Court of the Philippines by Woodrow Wilson, where he served for 19 years. In his autobiography, Justice Malcolm concludes his section on Taft with the following. William H. Taft, along with Elihu Root, was responsible for the initiation of our country's Philippine policy and for its success from the standpoint of far-sighted statesmanship. He stands as the greatest single American figure in the history of the Philippines. I'd appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Professor, why were we involved with the Philippines then?
We were involved in the Philippines, of course, because the Philippines were Spanish at the time of the Spanish-American War. Theodore Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of Navy, had put out orders to attack the Philippines and to sink the Spanish fleet if possible. The 1st of May, 1898, is exactly what happened. And under these circumstances, we came into the possession of the Philippine Islands after a deal of agonizing on the part of William McKinley, whether we should let them go, keep part of them, or take the whole archipelago. He said he prayed, and he decided after prayer that he would recommend that we take all of the Philippine Islands.
How long was William Howard Taft in the Philippines?
He was there about 4 years, but he came home twice for surgery, and he had to go to the Vatican to negotiate the purchase of the friars' lands. So I would say probably as much as 24 months altogether. And the weather was very hard on him. And he was duty-bound to visit as much as he possibly could. He had the utmost confidence in the ability of the Filipino people to rule themselves in the long term. And therefore, he worked to that effect.
What do we know about his health over the years, Kurt Topham?
His health was reasonably good. His weight, of course, was a detriment to some degree, but he was a very active man in the White House. He took part in exercise programs and was athletic as a young man, so he was quite athletic at times.
When people come to this house, first of all, when can they visit?
The house is open to the public from 10 to 4 every day. We are closed only Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's.
And does it cost anything to visit this?
The entrance is free.
And are there any other points in Cincinnati that are affiliated with the former president?
There is another, the Taft Museum, which is downtown on Pike Street, and that is the former residence of his older half-brother, Charles Phelps Taft, who we discussed a little earlier, who married well and helped finance William Howard's run for the presidency.
Next phone call, Columbia, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning. It was interesting, the last caller mentioned Taft as Governor General, and the quotation that he came up with failed to mention the man who was there before Taft, and that was General Arthur MacArthur, the father of Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur had been the governor, or military governor, and he and Taft did not get along well when Taft was sent as president of the Civilian Commission, although MacArthur had actually instituted great reforms in judicial and land reform in the Philippines, which were actually a model that his son used in Japan later. But what I find interesting is politics making strange bedfellows. MacArthur and Taft did not get along well, and when Taft became Secretary of War, he did not promote Arthur MacArthur to the new post of Chief of Staff, and MacArthur later retired when Taft became president. However, the sons of these two men, Douglas MacArthur and Robert Taft, actually became very good friends, and MacArthur was, the talk was in 1952 that he was a very strong vice presidential candidate to run with Taft on the Republican ticket. I'd like any comment you might have about that.
Professor?
Yes, well, of course you're correct. The military and the civil branches do not always get on well together. What you say about General MacArthur is true in terms of his reform instincts, but at the same time, the military at any rate, was, in Taft's judgment, too extreme in the measures they were taking against the Filipino insurrectionaries. It was a guerrilla war. It was an atrocious war on both sides. The water treatment was standard practice. Taft, of course, was by instinct, by temperament, by commitment, a man of peace. And therefore, as the civilian chief, with the backing of Elihu Root, who was Secretary of War, as the civilian chief, he thought it appropriate, indeed in this case necessary, to bring the military under the control of the civil branch, and that's exactly what he did. And of course, I suppose whether the general is General MacArthur Douglas or General MacArthur Arthur, it doesn't necessarily sit well. I refer, of course, to the Douglas MacArthur Harry Truman set to.
North Little Rock, Arkansas. Good morning.
Good morning. Great program and great series. I'd like to ask the professor, would you mind elaborating more on the Taft-Roosevelt split? I wonder how personal did it get? What were the primary issues? And after Roosevelt was responsible for Woodrow Wilson election because of the split, what was the relationship between the two? Thank you very much.
Professor.
Well, to begin with, they were not what I would say close personal friends ever. They were very close professional friends. Each man tended to turn toward his own family, his own brothers, his own relatives for advice, and Taft more so than T.R. The issues between the two, of course, arose mostly from Taft's poor handling of the Ballinger-Pinchot controversy over conservation. But these were added to by Gifford Pinchot, who sped off to Italy. Roosevelt was on his famous Tennessee at the time, sped off to Italy, to Porto Maurizio, where he poisoned Roosevelt with talk about how inept, how anti-conservationist Taft was. And that, to Roosevelt, was the cause. And therefore, whatever else happened after that, Taft's failure to come to Hoboken, New Jersey to greet the president, the ex-president, I should say, on his way home from his Tennessee, was a little thing, but symbolic, and so on. I do think that the issues were both personal and political, and I think Roosevelt was a little bit disappointed that Taft was not more, well, willing to give way to Roosevelt in matters. Taft wanted to be his own man, and he was his own man, perhaps to his cost, but nonetheless, that's the way it was.
We are going to, in just a few minutes, give you a little bit of a look at the library here. Ray Henderson is in the library. Mr. Henderson, what is the importance of that room?
Well, the library is one of my favorite rooms in the house because it's the essence of the Taft family. They would gather here in the evenings to read and study. Books were a very big part of their life. They were all well educated, and so this was more or less a family room where they got their foundation.
What did he read?
Well, his father, of course, collected a lot of the classics of that time, Tacitus, Livy, and those types of things. When William Howard Taft was 9 years old, he was reading The Life of Washington by Washington Irving. I think Professor Burton has an interesting story about one of his favorite books that he might want to share later on.
Well, we'll let him do it right now. Professor, what's it?
Well, it's my understanding, at any rate, that when he was courting Nellie Herron, they used to meet in the library, the Mercantile Library, or whatever it might be called downtown, and they would read to each other, they would read together, and according to his grandson, one of his grandsons, their favorite book was Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. And it's the kind of book that they would be interested in, I dare say, and I think they were taking great comfort with each other as they took comfort with George Eliot or Mary Ann Evans, the writer of Mill on the Floss.
So is it fair to say the books brought the two of them together?
I would say that ideas in books, as well as books such as fiction, undoubtedly were magnetic for both of them.
Ray, can you show us inside one of those books? Earlier we saw a stamp or an autograph by the Father Alfonso.
Sure. When Alfonso was tutoring at Yale, even his students realized how important books were to him, and they gave him this class, the class of 1838, to tutor Alfonso Taft, presented by the South Division.
Kurt Topham, how many of the books in this home are original?
Quite a number of the ones in the collection are original. We have had many of the books given back to us, books that were given by Alfonso to students, to other organizations, to the University of Cincinnati. Many of those have come back to us to the park.
So if somebody has something that they've either bought or had handed down to them that they'd like to give back, they can give them to you?
They can certainly contact us, and we would be very happy to talk with them about it and perhaps add it to our collection.
Ray Henderson, in that library you also have a couple of copies of the local newspaper. What's that?
Yes, this is the Cincinnati Daily Enquirer, and the significance of this paper is the fact that it's on William Howard Taft's 8th birthday, Friday, September 15th, 1865, and shortly after the Civil War, which was a big topic here in the Taft household.
Professor, what impact, if any, would the Civil War have had on this 8-year-old boy?
Virtually none. The war was over by the time he began to shape his ideas. I'm not sure of this, but perhaps Yale once again became a place where Southern students went north to study. One of the colleges at Yale today is named Calhoun, and I would think that he was too absorbed with school, with doing well at the local, he did go to the local high school, too absorbed doing well with school and doing, if I may put it this way, what his father wanted him to do. He was a very dutiful son, and I think in the long term that paid off because he said to his son, he said to William Howard, if you get into politics, you've got to be very careful to avoid corruption. And certainly Taft was successful in that respect.
Kurt Topham, did his degree of dutifulness to his father have anything to do with the number of children prior to him who had died in infancy? Or was this much beyond that?
I don't know that that had anything to do with it, but his dutifulness and his duty to his father led him throughout his career. Just as an example, as he loved the law, and his desire was to be on the Supreme Court. When he was in the Philippines, he was actually offered a seat on the Supreme Court, and he turned it down. He felt that his duty to the Philippine people was not complete. And it goes back to Ray's quote a little earlier about a personal goal not standing in the way of a public good.
Kurt Topham, you also have mentioned that there's the law, and we have some video of a statue at the University of Cincinnati of William Howard Taft. Why is that important in terms of remembering his life?
William Howard completed his law degree at the University of Cincinnati, and there is a law program named after William Howard Taft at the University of Cincinnati.
But Yale was the home where he got his law.
No, Yale was his undergraduate.
His undergraduate
He went to the
degree.
University of Cincinnati. He came home to study at Cincinnati. And I think that also speaks to the whole Taft's family dedication to Ohio, the identification of Ohio and the Tafts in Ohio.
At this point in time, how many presidents had come from this part of the country in that period between the Civil War and...
Well, William McKinley and Garfield and Taft himself, Hayes. The mother of presidents, Virginia gave way for a while as the mother of presidents to Ohio.
Richmond, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. I have two statements to make and then a question about Alonzo Taft. As I was reading, this name Bonesman keeps coming up, even up into our modern day politics. Alonzo Taft, he helped organize the backroom settlement of a deadlock in the 1876 presidential election. The bargain gave Rutherford Hayes presidency in '81 and withdrew the U.S. troops from the South where they had been forcing black rights. The other statement I want to make, there was a man by the name of Henry Neal Mallon who was, they made drill bills, Standard Oil, and they were very close friends of the Taft family. Neal Mallon, George W. Bush's brother, is named after him. So you see the thread, the influence of the Taft and the Republican organization right up into modern day politics. So that is my statement, and I guess there's no question involved.
Okay, all right. Any response, Professor?
It's a comment that certainly should be made, and I thank the caller for it, because he goes back before William Howard comes on the scene to the disputed election of 1876 and the commission which put Rutherford B. Hayes in office and withdrew Union troops, or can't call them Union troops now, but federal troops from the South. So, in effect, 5 generations of Tafts have been serving the nation and Ohio.
Kurt Topham, we're going to let you go, but thank you very much for hosting us here, as we're here for another hour and a half today. The National Park Service's role in this home is what?
We manage the site. We keep it open for the public. We develop programs, and we are currently developing outreach programs to the schools of Cincinnati, and we hope that this program will develop into a very large following and bring a lot of folks to Cincinnati.
How can people reach you?
They can write to us at the park address, William Howard Taft National Historic Site, 2038 Auburn Avenue, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45219. Or they can give us a call, area code 513-684-3262, and we'll be happy to respond to any of their requests, including informational requests. We respond to quite a number of kids who are doing papers for their schoolwork.
Thanks very much for joining us this
My
morning.
pleasure.
Back into the library, Ray Henderson, I wanted to ask you about the role of Nellie Henderson, the president's wife, in something that a lot of people know about, and that is the cherry blossoms around the area of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. today. What's the correspondence of the Tafts and these trees?
Well, Mrs. Taft was very involved. You know, she'd spent some time in Tokyo on one of her trips, and the mayor of Tokyo donated 3,000 cherry trees to be planted on the tidal basin. And those, of course, died initially, but they brought in more. And because of Mrs. Taft's gift, they celebrate the Cherry Blossom Festival every year there in Washington.
How did she get the idea?
Well, when she was in the Philippines, she liked the view. She saw the trees there. She saw the trees in Tokyo, and she thought that this would really spruce up the Washington area.
Take our next call is from Washington, D.C. Good morning.
Good morning. I've got a quick comment and a question. The comment is, oh, C-SPAN, you're doing a fabulous job, and I'm a senior citizen, and am I waiting for the next few months when we get into the active presidents.
Ah, who are you waiting for?
Oh, ma'am, I'll tell you, I'm really excited over that. But for Taft, for this program particularly today, ma'am, could you or perhaps your guest, either one of them, comment? I got in just a little bit late, and I think this is mostly for the professor. Sir, is Taft considered a Republican or a Democrat in comparative or in our time? You follow me? Would you classify him? Now, Teddy Roosevelt was a definite Democrat, right?
No, he was a definite Republican.
Oh, excuse me, definite Republican. Yeah, okay, I'm a little mixed up. But back to you, Professor. Would you answer my question? Put him in contemporary times, would you?
Thanks.
Put him in contemporary times. He would be running as a moderate Republican, I would believe, based on two things. And, of course, now we're looking at the total Taft, not simply the presidency, but also the time on the Supreme Court. He would have been a moderate Republican because he did believe that the president's office had limitations. He wrote about it, in fact, in one of his books, The President and His Powers. On the other hand, he favored the system of postal savings for the little investor, the dollar investor. Before that time, if people wanted to put their money away safely and couldn't go to the bank because they didn't have enough money, they had to buy a money order. They had to pay the government to save their money for them. And as a Supreme Court justice, I know he has the reputation, and I think it's been glossed over, he has the reputation of being very conservative, but in point of fact, when it came to humane considerations, like the women who worked in the District of Columbia hospitals, and the law in the District of Columbia was to try to give them a minimum wage, and the court struck down that law as unconstitutional, Taft and Holmes joined together in dissent, insisting that the ladies of the hospital workers' crews should have the protection of a minimum wage law.
You mentioned the president's books. Ray Henderson, did President write any books himself?
Yes, there are several books and papers that William Howard Taft wrote, and Dr. Burton is actually getting these all published, getting the collected works of William Howard Taft published. He's working on that right now. I guess the President and His Duties and several other of his writings that Dr. Burton is collaborating with right now.
When do we expect to see those?
Well, it's in its infant stage, maybe even embryonic. But be that as it may, let me fill in by saying that Taft did write 3 books while he was Kent professor at Yale. He wrote Popular Government, which revealed him as a moderate Republican, moderate progressive, if you will. He wrote the Antitrust Act and the Supreme Court, which is very good history. He goes back into the English common law. He goes back into the times of the Tudors and the Stuarts. And then he wrote his big book, his magnum opus, if you will, The President and His Powers. And therefore, he really did adapt nicely to academic life at Yale. He loved Yale. And he adapted very nicely to academic life, but the gods had a different future for him than the academic.
Our caller from Washington said she was getting excited that we were getting up into some of the more modern presidents. It's starting to play out now. I noticed that in the year that William Howard Taft was running for president, 1908, was the year that LBJ was born in Texas. And in 1911, when he was into his first term, was the year that Ronald Reagan was born in Illinois. So we're beginning to trickle into the later presidencies now.
I hope we're not going to have the entrance of astrology into all this.
Atlanta, Georgia, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to talk about the campaign of 1912 and how the sinking of the Titanic played a little bit of a role in it. Because I know that Theodore Roosevelt said that William Howard Taft was as big as the Titanic, and also that his policy decisions were as foul as the officers on the Titanic. And also I know that William Howard Taft lost a friend on the Titanic, and I was just wanting to hear your opinion on that.
Professor?
Yes, he lost Archie Butt, a noble creature, apparently, by all accounts. I suppose the analogy of the Titanic was inevitable, or the reference to it, but the president in the election of 1912 was a misfortune for the Republican Party because the two Republicans decided to cancel each other out. And by Taft insisting that he have the nomination, and even though in the primaries he did not do well at all, there were only 13 primaries, and as you may have heard earlier on C-SPAN this morning, primaries were not as important then as they are now. Nonetheless, by insisting that he get the nomination, he spiked Roosevelt's guns, but on the other hand, Roosevelt spiked the Republican Party's guns by splitting the party down the middle, and as the early part of our show this morning pointed out, it paved the way for Woodrow Wilson, only the second Democrat since the Civil War, to be elected to the presidency.
And Woodrow Wilson, we are going to be there at Stanton, Virginia, which was the home of Woodrow Wilson, next Monday, a week from today, beginning at around 9 o'clock in the morning. We hope you can join us then when we will be moving on to the 28th president. But right now we're still with William Howard Taft in Rochester, New York. You're next up. You're with Ray Henderson and the Professor Burton. Go ahead, Rochester. Rochester, New York, one more time. Rochester is not there.
Very Florida.
The 1908 campaign, there was something called Taft as an acronym calling Take Advice from Theodore. Was that used?
That was used, and that tends to skewer Taft as president, because when the nominating convention met, Taft was not there, of course. Roosevelt entered the convention floor, and he got a 47-minute standing ovation. 4 more years, 4 more years. But he had already told the convention chairman, Henry Cabot Lodge, absolutely not. So that Nellie Taft said, Will, don't be a surrogate for Theodore Roosevelt. He's going to return from Elba, and he will expect you to step aside.
Is it true that Nellie Taft did not trust Theodore Roosevelt?
She not only did not trust him, she disliked him. She disliked the Roosevelts qua Roosevelts. She insisted on riding back to the White House, breaking protocol, and riding back to the White House after the inauguration, despite the snow, rather than have Roosevelt come back and then take his leave from the White House. Roosevelt and his wife sped off to Union Station to take a train north. No, there was a very, and I don't know the source of that. I really don't know the source of that. It could be chemical. Could be chemical.
Ray Henderson, we are going to be joining you just a little bit later in our program. We hope you can stay with us. We were going to have you go upstairs, and in just a few minutes we will be back and you can show us some of the photos that go along with the rest of the history there. So we'll be back with you in just a minute. Tracy, California. Good morning. We are joined in Tracy, California with Gail Chaika. Gail Chaika is a... Gail Chaika, are you there? No. Let's go ahead and take this call from Tracy, California. Good morning.
Good morning.
Tracy, California, go ahead.
Good morning. I am familiar with the reasons why Taft ran for the presidency in 1908, but not about his re-election. He apparently was not happy in office, so was he pressured by his wife and the Republican Party to run again? Thank you for your answer.
Thank you for your question. Incumbents almost instinctively want to run on their records. He was not interested in being president again, on the one hand, but he looked upon Roosevelt's possible candidacy as a disaster for the nation. Now, I have to say this, that Taft followed Roosevelt's progressive, his moderate progressivism while president to a large degree. Not totally, but to a large degree. But Roosevelt moved far to what I suppose we would have to say the left between 1909 and 1911. And Taft thought that he could not be trusted if he were returned to office in 1912 as a Republican. And therefore, Taft saw himself laying himself on the altar of the Republican Party to prevent Roosevelt from becoming president in 1912. And if that meant a Democrat came into office in 1912, then so be it. Better, and this is not what the regular Republicans are used to saying, I suppose, better a Wilson Democrat than a Roosevelt Republican, as Roosevelt was in 1912. Roosevelt became more and more radical, at least in his speech. Of course, had he been elected, he undoubtedly would have moderated a great deal of what he was saying. It's almost, and this is going to be controversial to the Roosevelt people, I suppose, it's almost as though Theodore Roosevelt became an anti-hero.
Thank you for the call, Tracy, California. It's a little bit of confusion there. We're next going to be talking with a teacher who teaches in a school that 4th and 5th graders at Taft Elementary School in Lakewood, Ohio. Her name is Gail Chaika. Good morning, Ms. Chaika.
Good morning.
Tell me why your school is named after William Howard Taft.
Well, you know, we have our Ohio-born presidents used as names for all of our elementary schools except for one, which is named after Franklin. So we have Garfield, Grant, Harrison, Hayes, Lincoln, Madison, McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft.
And all in that area?
Right, in our Lakewood City schools.
How do you teach about William Howard Taft in your school?
Well, we have looked at things like the duties of the office of president, and we've talked about his experience in the context of a timeline, and we look at historical events at the state, national, and international levels. We consider those the impact of people and events on the branch of government that we're studying.
What is it about former President Grant that interests 4th and 5th graders these days?
Well, I think they were very impressed that he worked in two distinct areas of the federal government and was Chief Justice, and found that actually he was probably wearing that hat more comfortably, enjoyed being the lawyer, the Chief Justice, even more than being president.
Did you have a question for Professor Burton today?
Well, one thought was, I was wondering if we have the correct perception of him in that he liked to expedite the laws that were already in place, and that he was really good at administering what existed in those expectations rather than as a being comfortable as a new program initiator.
Gail Chaika, thanks very much.
He was indeed an administrator. He was a detail man. That accounted for his great success in the Philippine Islands, and it also accounts for his much greater success as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a man who followed a rather weak Chief Justice, Edward Douglas White, and some of the people on the bench were a little bit concerned. Taft was an ex-politician, an ex-president. What would he be like? But he was a superb administrator. And his administration of the court in the 1920s put the court back in the center of American attention in terms of the judiciary. The court had not a good reputation before Taft came along because, well, for one thing, the Supreme Court had to listen to every appeal which came to it. It had no choice. And Taft said, there are too many cases, we're 2 or 3 years behind, we've got to do something about this, therefore the Congress, and remember the Congress controls the court in terms of legislation, the Congress agreed to allow the court to determine, to certify which cases were of the greatest importance for understanding the Constitution, to hear those cases and those cases only, unless, of course, it's a case brought by a state.
We asked the teacher from the Taft Elementary School to join us because we wanted to emphasize that one of the big things we do with this series is encourage teachers to use it in their classrooms. Here's how you, if you are a teacher and if you would like to use this series on the presidency in your classroom, you can give us a call and we'll be happy to send you as much information as we can about it. We have a big packet of information we can send you, and it's all free, nothing you have to pay for, but you can also then use this video in your classrooms. You can call us at 202-626-4858. Now, I tell you that because this is a federal holiday, there will be an answering machine there. Someone will answer your call tomorrow. If you just leave us a message with your name and your phone number on it, we'll get back to you tomorrow. Also, you could go to cspan.org/classroom, and you can also sign up there. Again, these are specifically programs for teachers to be able to use our programs in your classroom. Next is from Florida. Our call is from Florida, and I don't know how to pronounce the name. Is it Tavares?
No, ma'am, it's Tavares.
Tavares. Hello, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. I just have a comment to make. Prior to the bicentennial year, an artist named Lawrence Williams did a series of portraits of each of the presidents and also each of the first ladies. And with these portraits, when he published them in a book, he put a little biographical sketch. And he said that the reason that the Japanese cherry trees were planted was in celebration of the Taft's 25th wedding anniversary. And I just wanted to add that in. Thank you for your series.
Thanks very much. Lawrenceville, New Jersey, you're next. Good morning. Good morning, Lawrenceville.
Hello.
You're on the air.
All right. My question for Professor. My question for Mr. Burton was about the religion of William Howard Taft.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes, the religion. Well, Taft's father was a Baptist who became very immersed in Emersonian idealism, and I think could be said to have left the Baptist denomination, at least internally, if not externally. Taft himself was a Unitarian, and this issue was brought up in the 1908 election, words to the effect that how can we vote for someone who is President of the United States who doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ? And Taft was open and above board about this. He said, I believe in God, I respect the teachings of the New Testament, but quite simply, I am not a Christian in the sense, I'm a Christian in the social sense rather than in the theological sense. He said the same thing to people in the 1890s who thought he might make a very good president of Yale. He said, no, the president of Yale should be a cleric. I'm not a cleric, and I am a Unitarian, and therefore he backed off from that as well.
William Howard Taft was born in this house in 1857. The house is located in Auburn Hills area, or Mount Auburn area rather, of Cincinnati. Cincinnati is about 400,000 people today. It was about 150,000 people when President Taft was born here. And Cincinnati, as you can see, located in the southwest part of Ohio. We're going to take you up to the second floor of this house right now and show you a little bit of an exhibit that is on display with some photos of the early career of William Howard Taft and also a little bit about his family. There's some pictures here. Tell us a little bit about his wife, Nellie.
Nellie was the daughter of a Cincinnati lawyer. She wanted to be a lawyer herself, so legend has it at any rate, but many lawyers were trained in law offices in those days, and law offices had one of the features might have been a cuspidor, and not the sort of room that ladies are comfortable in. She was strong-minded, very intelligent, as has been said before, ambitious for her husband, to be sure, but also very caring for her husband. I think, for example, one thing that stands out in my mind is that Taft took his family with him to the Philippines. He could not bear the thought of being separated from Nellie, and I suspect that Nellie could not bear the thought of being separated from Will. And so they went off with their 3 children to the Philippines, and she was by no means the first politician's wife who had great ambitions for her husband. I think in this respect, her ambitions were sound, they were solid, and she knew the kind of man he was. He would make a good president. He would meet the expectations of the American people in terms of character. And
what about this story or the contention that Nellie was a lot like his mother, that there were, in some ways, a correlation there?
Oh, yes, the pop psychology approach to William Howard Taft's weight and his relationship to his wife and so forth. Could be. I'm not a pop psychologist.
They had 3 children.
They had 3 children. And these are the children that accompanied them to the Philippines. And I suppose the kids, to speak of them in that way, thought it was a lark. And in some ways it was. After all, he was the boss man in the Philippine Islands. And in the Philippines, the Tafts did a lot of entertaining. They went out and they extended their social hand, not only their military hand and their tax hand, but their social hand to the best families in the Philippines. Some families were great landowners, some were well educated in Europe and Spain perhaps, and as a consequence they breached the social chasm which existed when the military was there.
We have a picture of the three children with the president and the First Lady. Do you know when this picture was taken, or about what time period? The youngest, Charles, would probably, looks like maybe around 11 or 12 there. Hard to say.
I wouldn't hazard a guess. I did want to add one other thing. He couldn't have been as successful a civil governor without Nellie Taft there taking care of the social aspects and meeting the Filipino ladies. That, I think, was a vital contribution to the whole success story of Taft in the Philippines.
Cincinnati, your next call from right here. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I had a question in regards to how did Alfonso or the president play a part in the civil rights movement of the day? And I'll hang up and listen.
Thanks, Cincinnati.
I will not speak for Alfonso because I really don't know. Taft, the civil rights movement of the day, if we place that in the context of the early part of the 20th century, rather than the 19th, and therefore, if you will, that part of the Taft career which was in politics, the presidency, I do know from looking at his campaign speeches in 1908 that he went out of his way on 2 or 3 occasions to address what was called in those days the Negro issue. I assume, therefore, that you're thinking in terms of civil rights today as black, Latino, minority problems with civil rights being respected. He certainly paid little or no attention to the civil rights of the Native Americans. I don't think that was an issue, and in my reading of his speeches and his off-the-cuff remarks and his letters, I see no reference to that. He, however, should not be interpreted as being strongly in favor of the movement of civil rights in terms of the black community, although he did try to stay Theodore Roosevelt's hand in the whole Brownsville affair. He thought Roosevelt had acted unwisely in condemning all those black soldiers to punishment because one of them or more of them may have committed a murder in Brownsville, Texas.
A photo of President Taft in the Philippines. We'll show that as we take our next call from Pleasant Hill, California. Hello.
Yes, my name is David. I'm calling from Pleasant Hill.
Welcome.
And I want to thank C-SPAN because you're not only helping to educate a new generation now, but also many people that didn't learn this the first time around.
Did you?
Pardon?
Did you learn it the first time around?
Actually, I've always been interested in history, but I do definitely learn more every program, so it's greatly appreciated.
Your question for our guest this morning.
Okay, I wanted to agree with his position on Roosevelt and Taft, and Taft basically throwing himself on the sword to stop Roosevelt's campaign in the 1912 election. The 1908 election, there wasn't just a lot going on right then, aside from maybe the appointments to the Supreme Court. And the 1912 election, of course, you would have the issue of when to get involved and how the readiness in the nation for World War I. I was wondering what you would think on that theory.
I would ask you, are you being premature when you talk about the 1912 election and World War I? Now, it's true the Balkan Wars were already on, and 20/20 hindsight tells us that this was a prelude to the Great War, as that generation called it. But I believe that the issues in the 1912 election were almost exclusively domestic. And I think that it was a question of degree that we had a moderate Republican, we had what could be called a much less moderate Republican in Theodore Roosevelt, and we had a fairly conservative Woodrow Wilson. You know, if you look at the New Freedom of Woodrow Wilson, his basic document for the 1912 election, he's much more conservative than Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism. And what happened to Wilson, of course, when he got into office, he discovered that the New Freedom didn't work, and therefore he had to become a New Nationalist, as he did. For example, he supported the Federal Reserve Act, which he wouldn't have done in theory when he was writing his books back at Princeton in, let's say, 1906 or 1907.
How did William Howard Taft become Secretary of War?
He became Secretary of War on appointment, of course, of Theodore Roosevelt, based upon, well, to become Secretary of War, the old Secretary has to leave. And Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War at the time, said to Theodore Roosevelt, I'm going back to New York and practice law, so you better find someone to fill in for me. And Roosevelt said, well, no better man than your auxiliary in the Philippine Islands, William Howard Taft. And so Taft, the War Department was the cabinet office which was responsible for administering the Philippines. And we'd had no colonial secretary, as the British Empire might have had a colonial secretary. And so this was an ad hoc arrangement. And so Taft was almost an obvious choice by TR. By the way, he had met Taft when Taft was Solicitor General from 1890 to 1892. Taft was part of, at least on the fringe of the so-called Henry Adams Seminar, which included some of the bright intellectual lights in Washington at that time.
Earlier in our program, we saw a portrait of Alphonso Taft. And if we're correct, I think that that's the same portrait that's in a picture, that's in an exhibit, that the portrait of his father, who was also Secretary of War, hung in his office while he was Secretary of War. There's the photo that we have, and it looks like this. Yes, that might be the same portrait there. I also wanted to ask you about this coat that he has on in this photograph that we have. That's some coat. Was he a dapper dresser?
It seems like a prelude to the era of the raccoon coat of the 1920s. After all, he was a Yalie.
He was a Yalie, that's true.
Raccoon coats at Yale, I'm sure, were pretty big in the 1920s.
What did he have to do with the Panama Canal?
If you read the history of the Panama Canal, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to make the dirt fly in Panama, all well and good, and Roosevelt had a great deal to do with securing the territory. But when it came to the construction of the canal, it fell to the War Department. And by that time, Taft was Secretary of War. And he had to jump-start it. It was not going well at all. And he said, went down and visited the canal, saw who was in charge, didn't like the people that were in charge, put new people in charge. And I think he kick-started the construction of the Panama Canal. And again, this idea how good he was at detail. He mastered every detail of the construction problems, and he looked at them intently. He studied the maps. He studied even though he was not trained as an engineer, he tried to understand the engineers' comments. And I think he was vital to the construction, to the completion of the canal by the time it was completed in 1912.
Lufkin, Texas, you're next.
Good morning. I've really enjoyed your show so far, and I've really learned so much about all the presidents you have shown. And there's about at least 3 questions that probably been answered before. What's happened to his bathtub? Is he the only president so far served as Chief Justice? And has he been the first or the only one so far served as the governor of another country? Thank you, and keep it up.
Thank you. Well, it's possible, and I'm being whimsical here, that the bathtub is stored in a museum, in the Smithsonian Museum. Possible. Unlikely. He's the only man in our history who's been both president and Chief Justice. And you said something about the governor of a state.
Governor of, I think you meant meaning the governor of the Philippines.
Oh, governor of the Philippines. Certainly the only president, the only man who became president who was a civil governor in that sense, rather than a governorship of a state.
To what degree is the bathtub story apocryphal?
When William Howard Taft was Secretary of War, he weighed 325 pounds. His biographer, Henry Pringle, has a very complete, I think it goes to 2.5 pages, of his regimen, which he followed very closely in terms of exercise and diet, to bring his weight down from 325 to 250 in the course of about a year and a half. So that doesn't mean that at 250 he didn't need an outsized bathtub, but he had less need of it than he would have when he was 325.
We have a photo of 4 men sitting in a bathtub from the exhibit upstairs. It looks like this is the one that was brought into the White House, at least.
I would say the question is who got him out, but that's another matter altogether.
Corpus Christi, Texas. You're next with Professor Burton. Good morning. Corpus Christi, are you there? Let's try
Hello.
Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, go ahead.
This is Corpus Christi.
Go ahead, Corpus Christi. Good morning.
There was a ranch that David Senton, who I think was probably the father-in-law of President Taft's uncle, owned a very large ranch here right close to Corpus Christi. I wonder if Mr. Burton would comment on that. It was a very significant piece of holding in the Taft family.
Any idea, Professor?
Mr. Burton would love to comment on it if he could, but he can't, so he won't.
How extensive was the Taft fortune? Were they rich people at the time?
I would say they were super comfortable without being Gilded Age rich. For example, they wouldn't run with the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And, of course, that's New York-sized money as opposed to Cincinnati-sized money. According to Mr. Henderson here at the Taft Museum, when they moved to this particular house, they looked upon themselves as stepping up in the social ladder because he did have a lucrative, and one lucrative is perhaps not the right word, he did have a successful law practice in the city of Cincinnati, which enabled him to purchase the house and to become one of the Cincinnati aristocracy in due season.
The 1908 campaign. How did William Howard Taft become the nominee?
William Howard Taft became the nominee because Theodore Roosevelt, on the night that his election became a reality in 1904, he was in the White House, and the news came in that he had won the election by a big vote over Alton Parker. And he left the room. He left the room in the White House and secreted himself for maybe 20 minutes, so the story goes. He came out and said, asked the Marine Band to be quiet. He had an announcement. I will not seek re-election in 1908. I will have had 7.5 years in the White House, and that's enough for any man. Remember, this is 1904. So having made that public announcement, Roosevelt, who was also a man of integrity and of character, said, in good faith, I cannot reverse myself. I'd like to be president again, but I've said I won't be, and therefore I need a successor. Very probably he thought that Elihu Root, who had been Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and Senator from New York, would have been his first choice, but Elihu Root had no fire in his belly when it came to politics, when it came to elective politics. Remember, senators were chosen by state legislatures in those days, and the other offices he had were appointeed. So he chose Taft, not because Taft was a kind of fallback position, but he knew Taft better than Root. And he knew that Taft believed in conservation, and Taft did. He knew that Taft believed in bus trusting, and President Taft's Secretary, or Attorney General, I should say, George Wickersham, became the scourge of Wall Street. He knew that Taft believed in many of the things he believed in, although not all. Taft, for example, believed in arbitration between countries, and Roosevelt did not. So that since Taft had been such an able lieutenant, he thought that he was a good choice. And the other people out there who might have been prospects simply, and he had an active dislike for Charles Evans Hughes, Roosevelt did, so Taft was there, and I don't want to give the impression that Taft was there by default. Taft was there because Roosevelt thought of him as a good successor to him, and went off to Europe and Africa and Europe for a number of months to give Taft free rein to run the presidency the way he thought appropriate.
He win overwhelmingly? Did Taft win overwhelmingly?
Oh, he won by a large margin. Yes, he defeated Eugene Debs. Well, a proven loser. How can you lose to Gene Debs? With all due respects to Gene Debs, who was in many ways a very important American, but not to Gene Debs. I'm sorry, to William Jennings Bryan.
William Jennings Bryan, right?
Debs was a third-party candidate. But I repeat what I said before. How can you lose to William Jennings Bryan because he was a proven loser? And even the Democrats said, well, we're going to re-elect another Republican president because we're running William Jennings Bryan for presidency.
New York City, hello.
My question is, what became of the Taft children, and are there any Tafts that went into politics later on, and are there still any surviving Tafts?
Boy, are there Tafts in politics. We're going to meet one of them a little bit later. This gentleman is not in politics, but he certainly is in the law. But there are a lot of Tafts still in politics.
Well, of course, Taft's son, Robert A. Taft, was Mr. Republican in the 1940s and 1950s, and he lost out to Dwight Eisenhower for the presidential nomination in 1952. His son became a senator from Ohio, too. He was called, rather euphemistically, Young Bobby, even though he was well up in years when he was a senator, but he was Young Bobby insofar as the family was concerned. The current governor of Ohio is Bob Taft, who is a direct descendant of William Howard Taft. And
wasn't Taft's son the mayor of this city?
He was, yes.
Youngest son?
And other relatives have been mayors or ran for office in Cleveland, for example. Seth Chase Taft was not the mayor, but he did run for mayor. So they are a political family, and as someone has so well said, they are a political dynasty. And it's quite possible that, and I'm not a prognosticator, it's quite possible that we have not heard the last of Bob Taft as governor of Ohio. Governorships very often lead to presidential nominations at the least.
And as we said, we'll be meeting William Howard Taft IV a little bit later in our program. St. Louis, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. As I recall, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was passed while Taft was still in office. Mm-hmm. The amendment gave Congress the power to levy and collect taxes based on income. How did President Taft feel about the 16th Amendment?
He probably, and I say probably because I can't focus on this directly, he probably thought it was time for such an amendment. And this is what I'm falling back on in answering that question. He was a man who believed in the, if you will, the sanctity of property. And of course, the income tax invades our sacred property. But Taft said more than once, I have much more respect for the man who earns his wealth than for a man who inherits his wealth. And therefore, I don't think that Taft was wedded to the idea that wealth must be left untouched. Now, of course, you must bear in mind that the income law, the income tax law, once the amendment was put into statute, was a very modest kind of tax. But I would fall back on my earlier observation. In principle, I would dare say that he would accept it in principle. It's the application of the principle that he might have at some time in the future a problem with.
One of the things we're also trying to do in this series is give people an idea of what the people's personalities were like for these presidents. There are a series of pictures up on the wall in the top floor of this building that show show William Howard Taft receiving the phone call in which he realized that he had gotten the nomination for President of the United States. One of the things that you see as these pictures kind of evolve is this grin coming across his face. And we hear a lot about the Taft infectious chuckle. Did he have an infectious chuckle?
He had an infectious chuckle. He was a jolly nice man. But to answer your question, or to comment on your question, when he was president and Roosevelt was back from Africa and Europe, he invited Roosevelt to visit him at Beverly Farms. And by this time, there were issues between them which were quite sharp, quite jagged, in fact. And Theodore wanted to talk about the trip. And Taft didn't want to talk about any issues at all. So he gave Roosevelt free rein to talk about his adventures with the papal diplomats and German Kaisers and British aristocracy and so forth. And Taft chuckled and chuckled and chuckled with all these anecdotes. But we're told that his chuckle was a chuckle of relief rather than a chuckle of amusement. But he was a very, try to answer your question further, this is what Oliver Wendell Holmes meant when he said, when Taft became the Chief Justice. He does such a good job of organizing us old men and making us get together. He's so happy. He's so positive. I think that he's an upbeat personality. Not that he couldn't be discouraged at times, but he was an upbeat personality.
David Burton is a professor in Pennsylvania, and he has written books about William Howard Taft. He'll be joining us as we continue our program. Right now, we want to show you a little bit about President William Howard Taft in Washington, D.C. William Howard Taft, when he was Chief Justice, lived in a home on Wyoming Avenue. It's in the Colorama neighborhood in Northwest Washington. You see it there on your screen. The home is still in Washington now, but it's really the Embassy of Syria today. A few years ago, we talked to a gentleman by the name of Badi Khattab. He's the minister counselor at the Syrian embassy. They still keep a portrait of William Howard Taft up in their conference room, and he talked a little bit about that. We'll be back in just a few minutes to continue.
We are at 2215 Wyoming Avenue. It's very well situated. And why we keep the picture of former President Taft is that we think this is a tribute to the man who was the only man in the history of the United States who held once the office, the high office of Supreme Justice, and as President of the United States. And people here are keen to knowing about their presidents, and they are educated about it. They go to other houses too. And the other reason is that back in Syria, we are also so keen to preserving old houses of historical significance. In fact, we have houses there that date back for centuries. Some of them have been perfectly maintained, and tourists go there sightseeing. So it's both respect for the man and for the historical value of the house, and it is in tandem with our culture.
Did you know, when this house was purchased, that it had that historic significance?
Of course. And there is another very nearby landmark, which is the bridge that also carries the name of President Taft. Actually, it's a 3-minute walking distance from here. So we did know that.
American Presidents programming. Next Monday, September 13th, we'll be at the Woodrow Wilson Birthplace Museum in Virginia to discuss the 28th president. The following week, on the 20th, Warren G. Harding is our focus, live from his home in Marion, Ohio. Then Monday, September 27th, we'll explore the 30th president from the Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site in Plymouth, Vermont. This Friday night at 8 Eastern, you can see our complete video record of William Howard Taft, including a replay of today's live program and other interviews and discussions. We do this each week, Friday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, as part of our American Presidents Life Portrait series. If you'd like to be more involved in C-SPAN's American Presidents Life Portrait series, enter our contest. Here's how. Based on what you've learned from the C-SPAN series American Presidents Life Portraits, create a portrait of one of the 41 presidents. Your entry can be in any format, including videotape, audio tape, website design, original art or music, or in writing. 20 grand prize winners will be C-SPAN's guests in Washington, D.C. on President's Weekend next year. That's February 19th through the 21st, 2000. Each grand prize winner will also win a 19-inch color television set. For contest rules or more information, check out our American Presidents website at www.americanpresidents.org or call us at 202-626-7963. Or write to us at C-SPAN Viewer Services, 400 North Capitol Street Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001. Now you can get our American President's T-shirt. On the back, the signatures of all 41 U.S. presidents, superimposed over the American flag. On the front, C-SPAN's American President's logo. This 100% pre-shrunk cotton T-shirt is available for $15.95 by calling 1-877-ON-C-SPAN. That's 1-877-662-7726. Or by visiting our online store at www.cspan.org. In a moment, we'll continue our look at the life of William Howard Taft, but first, some background information on the nation's 27th president.
You've just joined us. We're in Cincinnati, Ohio, the birthplace and boyhood home of President William Howard Taft. This is what Cincinnati looks like today, and that would have been the view from the Mount Auburn area where this house is. Cincinnati today, a city of about 400,000 people. It was about 150,000 in 1857 when William Howard Taft was born here. We are in the National Historic Site in this birthplace home in the parlor area, where we are joined by Professor Burton. Professor Burton teaches at St. Joseph's College, which is where?
St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia. And what kind of school is it?
It's a small university, a couple of divisions, primarily the College of Liberal Arts, but there's a business college and a university college, and it serves the Lower Main Line and the greater Philadelphia area, and is about to celebrate its sesquicentennial in the year 2001.
During this past break, our viewers saw the list of 5 Supreme Court appointments that William Howard Taft made while he was president. And as we know, he was the only president to also be Chief Justice. Does this mean that he might have served with people that he appointed?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. Nice work if you can get it. Yes.
Well, does it also mean that he might have sworn in, as Chief Justice, might have sworn in successive presidents?
Successive
presidents of the United States in inaugural ceremonies.
Could have done, yes, yes. Must have done, in fact. Why not?
Next, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I've never seen a picture of him swearing in Woodrow Wilson. Well, no, he wouldn't.
Wouldn't have been
Warren Harding.
Warren Harding would have been.
No, Warren Harding would. He did not.
1921.
Yes,
Went to the
it would have
Supreme
been Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge's father swore him in, and then he won again in his own. He won in his own right. He wouldn't have sworn in Herbert Clark Hoover because of health reasons, perhaps. But Calvin Coolidge in 24, very likely. Very likely.
Unusual circumstances that came from him holding both offices. Youngsdale, North Carolina is our next call and question. Good morning.
Good morning. What were some of the hobbies of Taft, William Taft? Thank you.
What was his what? Oh, hobbies?
Hobbies.
Hobbies. Professor?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt told him, "Dear Will, don't be seen playing golf because that's a rich man's game." So he did like to tee off. He also liked to ride horses, and sometimes his weight was such that people would say the poor horse. But he was a horseman, and as was pointed out earlier in the program, he did use what we would call today the weight room at the White House. I'm not sure that he swam, but he certainly did exercise, if you want to call exercise a hobby. But I would say, apart from the physical exercises I've mentioned, he liked to play cards. He and Nellie Taft and relatives were interested in playing cards for amusement, not for high stakes, but just for amusement.
I think this is a picture we're showing right here of the president at Yale, if I'm correct, at some kind of calisthenics or whatever.
It looks that way, doesn't
in
it?
complete outfits, white shirt and all, huh?
Yes, yes. Black shoes, I'm sure.
We're going over to the White House now, back to Washington, where we want to introduce you to a descendant of William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft IV is joining us at the White House this morning. Good morning, Mr. Taft.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Professor Burton said earlier today, called your family somewhat of a dynasty. Does your family think of itself as a dynasty?
I don't think we do, but there are a large number of us. We're certainly a crowd, and we've been around for quite a while.
What's a story that you can tell us about your great-grandfather?
Oh, my heavens, I should have thought of one, I guess. He was a man who had a lot of adventures and a lot of excitement in his life, but I guess one of the more exciting times was when he was traveling in the Orient with Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter. He was then Secretary of War, and his major responsibility then was for 3 months to chaperone Alice, and that was quite a job, much more difficult than the diplomatic tasks that he had over that time. He brought her back engaged to Nicholas Longworth, of course, who was from Cincinnati, and so that was all right, and he managed the job, but it was quite a handful.
Mr. Taft, walk us through your relationship to your great-grandfather, how it comes down.
His son was Robert A. Taft, and he had 4 sons, one of whom was my father, William Howard III.
And why do you think so many Tafts have gone into public office?
I don't know what it is. We like it, I guess, and I think we feel a sense of responsibility and a obligation to give back something that we've had. But I think more often than not, it's if somebody likes doing something, they are inclined to try it, and we've had enough success so that we keep at it. I should say not all of our family by any means is in politics or has ever had a great interest in it, but you certainly are aware of it as you're growing up in the family, so if you're inclined that way, you would be encouraged and end up there. But many of my cousins are not in politics and certainly never want to be in politics.
What is your relationship to the governor of this state of Ohio?
Bob Taft is my first cousin. He was my grandfather's oldest grandchild, and I was a little younger than he.
A couple years ago, we talked to him here in this house a little bit about the public service of your family. This is what he had to say.
Great-grandfather, grandfather, and yourself all in public office. Can you explain how that happened?
Well, so was my father. My dad was a United States Senator, and as we already heard, William Howard Taft's father, Alphonso Taft, was in President Grant's cabinet and an ambassador under President Arthur. So I think it must be in the genes, it's in the blood. I think the love of the law, particularly the desire to do public duty. An interesting story when my great-grandfather, William Howard Taft, was Secretary of War, and his mother was very, very ill. And he thought he should not go to the Philippines to open their National Assembly, as he had agreed to do because of her illness. And she said to him, to my knowledge, no Taft has ever neglected a public duty for the sake of a private pleasure. And for that really, I think, kind of sums up the sense of duty and obligation in the family. And of course, he went and did his duty in the Philippines.
William Howard Taft in Washington, you are a lawyer, is that correct?
That's right.
What about the family's relationship to the law?
We have had many lawyers in our group. I think actually in the president's generation, there were 3 lawyers out of 5 sons, and then both of his sons, of course, were lawyers. But then it begins to thin out a little bit. Actually, my father was not a lawyer, and my uncle was, but my 2 other uncles were not. So that's a. So there are a lot of lawyers. There are also a fair number of educators in our family, college professors and people who have started schools and things of that sort. So there's a large number of us all told, and many lawyers, yes.
I see you went to Yale. Your great-grandfather went to Yale. Is there a big tradition of that in your family?
Well, yes, it was pretty automatic in those days. We had to go, and they had to take us. But it was now we've spread out a little bit, quite a lot, and I think there are Tafts who've gone to colleges all over the country now.
William Taft, Howard Taft IV, is joining us at the White House. We have Professor Burton, who is here in Cincinnati with us at the home, which is the birthplace of William Howard Taft, and we're going to start taking some calls for both of you. Clifton Park, New York, your first stop. Hello.
Hi, this is Dave Bissett, homeschooling family, Clifton Park, New York. I had an observation and 2 quick questions, and then I'll hang up and listen. The observation is, it seems that President Taft was the last of our chief executives to sport facial hair. And then my 2 questions are, number 1, has anything been said about his vice president, Smiling Jim Sherman? And question number 2, why is William Howard Taft buried at Arlington Cemetery?
Okay, let's take those in reverse order and ask the descendant here why he is buried at National Cemetery at Arlington.
Well, I believe it was because he requested it, and of course he was entitled to it as a function of his service. He was a lifelong, not a lifelong, no, he was but a long-time resident of Washington. Starting in the 1890s, he was here in and out, and of course the last 10 years of his life he lived here on Wyoming Avenue, as you showed earlier, and so I think he felt at home in Washington and wanted to rest here.
Professor Burton, who was Jim Sherman?
Sonny Jim Sherman was a political hack from the state of New York and an ultra-conservative, old guard Republican. And it's interesting to note that the powers that were in the Republican Party felt that the Taft ticket ought to have been balanced by Sherman, because they saw in Taft a Roosevelt progressive. And therefore, maybe to get the conservative vote or the party line vote, they should have a vice president who was much more in the style of the old Gilded Age presidents. That is to say, the James Gillespie Blaines and people of that ilk, both of whom, both Roosevelt and Taft, held their nose and supported Blaine when he was running for the presidency at one time. But I think that's what should be known about hail fellow, well met, back-slapping, cigar-smoking, spittoon-using Sonny Jim Sherman of New York.
He died in office?
No, I don't think so.
No.
No.
I thought I'd read somewhere where he died a couple of days before the election of 1912.
Could have done.
I'd have to check that. Yeah. Bright's disease, I think. Maybe I'm confused. I'll check that out.
Sounds like you know a lot about it.
Mr. Taft,
I'll go with you.
Tell me about this facial hair question. What do we do? What do we do with that?
I think we say that that it's correct. He was the last one until the next one. Right, but he was the last one. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, had a mustache. McKinley didn't, so it was on its way out. But he was the last.
I don't know if we still have our camera up on the second floor, but there's a photo up there, and Mr. Taft, I know that you can't see us, but all the way in the back there's a photo of a big family, and it's probably a photo you're aware of, Mr. Taft, because it has the former president sitting just above, who I think is your father when he was just a young boy.
I'm familiar with the photograph, and that's right. It's with him and all of his children and grandchildren on the back porch of the house in Murray Bay, I believe.
Yes, it is. And your father, how old was he there? Maybe 10?
I think that's right. My father was born in 1915, and this would have been in the 20s, so he'd be around 10, yes.
And your father's occupation was what?
He was in the Foreign Service for many years, and before that he was a professor of English at Yale, and he was ambassador to Ireland for 4 years in the Eisenhower administration.
It also mentioned that our guest at the White House today was a Deputy Secretary of Defense from 1984 to 89, and acting secretary from January to March of 89. He was also our United States permanent representative to NATO from 89 to 92. Sioux Falls, South Dakota is next. Good morning.
Good morning. This is my first chance to listen to C-SPAN live. I've been watching this program usually on Friday nights and sitting down late night watching it. Very much enjoyed this series. One comment I would like to make at this time is I believe that Taft was probably the last of the progressive Republicans. It seems like from basically Fremont on, the Republican Party was considered the radical or maybe the liberal party of its time. And I'd always thought that Roosevelt, Theodore, was our last of the progressive Republicans, but I understand now from listening to this that probably Taft was our last one. Because it seems like the one Republicans that followed, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, etc., tended to be more from the conservative or regressive, I would probably call it, as opposed to the progressive party. And it seems like maybe the Democrats took over the progressive with Woodrow Wilson, with Wilson's enlightenment after he became president himself.
Professor Burton, why don't we have you take that?
All right. I think you're on target. When you first began to develop your statement, I was going to say, well, he was the last of the progressives because progressivism itself died out in the 1920s. But if we're looking at not so much the name, but the content, then I'm arguing fairly forcefully that he was a progressive president in the style of Theodore Roosevelt from 1906 to 1908. And that therefore he seems less progressive because Roosevelt becomes more progressive, and therefore is this sharp downturn. But when you consider, for example, that his Attorney General, who was responsible to him, of course, helped to shape the Elkins Act of 1910, which greatly strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, that's regulation of the corporation in the style of the progressive era, the progressive movement of the first part of the 20th century. It's built on the Hepburn Law, which Roosevelt, of course, helped to get through the Congress. And now Taft comes along and through his Attorney General does the same thing, and regulation is more effective, more progressive, if you will. And look at Taft's record. Look at the Attorney General's record under Taft. In 4 years, bust twice as many trusts as Roosevelt did in 7.5 years.
Mr. Taft, do you have anything else to say about that?
No, I think that's accurate as a characterization of Taft's administration. I would also point out that he was an internationalist in foreign policy, as Theodore Roosevelt was, and part of that tradition, and later on supported the League of Nations and international engagement by the United States, which of course also has become a point of controversy within our party since then.
Senator Rosa, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. First, I want to thank C-SPAN for putting on this wonderful series. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask the professor if he could explain the contrast of President Taft vetoing the law barring interstate transportation of liquor into dry states when he was, I believe, in favor of prohibition. I'm in the wine business and interested in all this transportation problems we're having now.
Professor?
Well, I'm speculating now, quite frankly, but it could well be that Taft believed this was the best thing for respect for the law, which, of course, meant a great deal to him. He, I would say, at times even seemed to reverence the law. But beyond that, I wouldn't speculate. I don't know the issue directly, and therefore I'm reluctant to come down hard on one side or the other.
Mr. Taft, do you know that the president was against prohibition?
I'm not sure that he was against prohibition. He did not take drink, but his wife did, and she may have had some influence on him.
Did he smoke?
I don't know.
Alamosa, Colorado, you're next.
Yes, I was calling in regards to the man that called from Corpus Christi earlier. In the small town of Catarina, Texas, there was a home built for President Taft. And, of course, in those days it was considered a mansion. And it was called the Taft Mansion. And the story goes that President Taft never saw the home. It has since been moved to the ex-governor's ranch, Governor Briscoe. He moved the home to his ranch. Does Mr. Burton know anything about that?
Actually, maybe Mr. Taft can help us out on that. Can you help us, Mr. Taft?
I have heard this too, but I must say I have not seen the house. I'll have to check in on it when I'm next down in Texas. But I've heard it, but I've not seen it.
Have you visited this house in Cincinnati?
I have been there, yes. Yeah.
What
Although it's much changed. Now, they've done some great things out there in the last years, which have improved it greatly, I know.
Quite a bit of renovation. Columbus, Ohio, you're next. Good morning. Columbus, are you there?
I'm trying to mute my TV. Okay, I wanted to know if there's any singers in the Taft family from Mr. Taft, because he has a nice voice, and our governor here in Ohio has such a booming voice. I think he could be an opera singer.
How about the singing?
I sing in the shower and in the car, mostly privately, and I think most people think it's better that way. The others in the family, I think, have good voices, but we're not distinguished in that line, at least for singing. Maybe we speak all right.
Professor Burton, I know there's a piano in the parlor room that we're in here. Do you know at all whether the Tafts were a musical family?
I do not know, no.
Next is San Diego. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. From cold and chilly San Diego. I'd like to comment on one reason that I've always had such a, dread of ultra-right conservatives, I guess. And basically this goes to the manifest destiny question, I guess, but I've always been curious as to how we can admire presidents who promoted colonialism and colonizing foreign nations such as the Philippines and other nations, of course, that we still hold as colonies. I think it's so against American ideals, what we stood for when we became a country ourselves, that I just can't square the two. And I really feel that the whole promotion of manifest destiny is one reason we have such a horrible racial problem and racial divide in this country today.
Professor?
You must remember that, your comments being general, you must remember that it was President McKinley who acquired the Philippine Islands for the United States at the end of the Spanish-American War. Having said that, you must remember that it was William Howard Taft who was sent out to the Philippines to, and I'm going to make an extreme statement here, rescue the Filipino people from the American Army, which was engaged in a bushwhacking war against the Filipino independence movement. Now, having said that, it is Taft who attempts to plant deep in the soil of the Philippines the roots of self-government. But he's a realist as well as an idealist. He realizes that you cannot teach a people in 10 years what it has taken us 100 years to learn, self-government. Self-government cannot be imposed. It has to grow up from the bottom. And is it better to have this attempt at Filipino self-government under the judicious hand of William Howard Taft and his successors as civil governors? Remember, the American intention was to give the Filipino people their freedom in 1944, July 4th. Those Japanese were there at the time and made it a bit awkward, and we had to postpone that until 1946. And the Filipino experiment in self-government, I think, thrived for a long while after World War II. It may have fallen on evil times in terms of Imelda Marcos, but what self-governing nation has not fallen on evil times from time to time? So I'm inclined to think that I'm not a colonialist necessarily, but like Taft, I'm a realist. What are you going to do with the Philippines if we do not move in and attempt to give them, to teach them, to tutor them in self-government? The Japanese, the Germans, the British would be on their doorstep in no time at all.
Cincinnati, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to say that I think that Philadelphia's Jesuit University should be proud of Professor Burton. And second, I'd like him to contrast campaign and communications in 1908 to the current time period.
In communications, you say?
Campaigning
Yes,
and communications.
Okay, Professor?
Well, campaigning was a lot shorter, for one thing. I was discussing with one of the staff here today that the campaign has already begun, and this is 1999. So I think the campaigning was shorter, more concentrated, and despite the lack of instant communication, in its own way more personal, because people turned out to see the candidates in large numbers. Remember, these people took barnstorming tours around the country. They gave speech after speech in a single day. So now, of course, we have the television image, we have all the paraphernalia of technology. We touch more people, but do we touch more voters? I think the voters were more committed in those days to the personality. But maybe I'm just being nostalgic for what passes for the good old days when the campaign began, when the conventions were held in the year of the convention, and the campaign began after Labor Day, in this case, year 2000.
Mr. Taft, what was your great-grandfather's relationship with the media, with the press?
I think that he had a fairly pleasant relationship later in his life. During the presidency, he was subject to quite a bit of criticism from the press, and I think it's fair to say he didn't take it well. He was perhaps overly sensitive to the criticism that came to him, and it depressed him. I don't think he was ever impolite or felt that anybody was doing anything other than their job when he thought about it, but it hurt him, and he didn't like it.
One of the things you hear is that he didn't feel a need or did not want to respond to criticism. either from the press or from his critics. What do you think about that in terms of a comparison of today and what happens in the presidential campaigns and indeed with the presidency itself?
I think the campaign of those days was much more suited to his personality than today it would be, although even then he was a little bit at odds with with politics. Politics was not something that aspect of the job of president was not his favorite.
Phoenix, go ahead.
Delighted to be talking to you. I have two questions. Number one, for the professor, what role did he play at all in World War I? Did Woodrow Wilson, because of Mr. Taft's diplomatic skills and his service to the country, did he use him at all as, in any kind of a capacity? My second question is for Mr. Taft. Being in the Senate was sort of a Taft public tradition. Robert Taft Jr. served in the Senate. His father, Robert Taft A. Taft, served in the Senate. What, in your opinion, was your cousin, Governor Taft's reason for running for governor? And he is also a great-great-grandson of William Howard Taft, not just a descendant, if I'm correct.
Let's go ahead and take the first part first, which is the World War I.
Yes. In response to your question, Woodrow Wilson called Professor Taft from New Haven, from Yale, to become co-chairman of the National War Labor Board. This was a kind of quasi-court which heard cases with respect to labor strikes and stoppages in war industries. And Taft did an absolutely splendid job, along with his co-chairman, Frank Walsh, who represented the laborers, and supposedly William Howard Taft represented the property owners. But Taft, more often than not, sided with Frank Walsh, and the two men together, working together closely, are given great credit for reducing the number of work stoppages, which, if they had increased, would have had a deleterious effect on the war effort. But I also want to add that Taft was the president of the League to Enforce Peace, and that was an organization which would be a rival to Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations concept. But Taft also recognized that President Wilson was the president, and therefore he had the ball to run with. And Taft, to his enormous credit, in my judgment, although a Republican and a man who had reason to dislike Wilson on other counts, put his shoulder to the wheel when it came to the League of Nations. He was a strong supporter of the League of Nations. He rose above partisanship. He rose above animosity. He was a real peacemaker. I think one of his finest hours.
Mr. Taft, your family in the Senate?
Well, we have been in the Senate, but they've also people have wanted to be governor in the past. And my great uncle Charlie ran for governor, and also my cousin Seth Taft made a run to be the nominee for governor. Bob has, the present governor, has always, I think, wanted that job, not the Senate, and I'm delighted that he has it. I know he enjoys it a great deal, and he's working very hard at it. So some people prefer the executive responsibilities that a governor has, and Bob's one of those, and at least at this point, and others prefer the legislative side that the U.S. Senate is about. They're rather different jobs and different temperaments, and I guess therefore that explains the different routes that people take.
Beverly, Massachusetts, hello.
Hello, this is Steve Hall from the Beverly Historical Society calling. I want to thank you for your wonderful series. In fact, I was so inspired that I set up a Taft Summer Capital website, and your producer was kind enough to link me to your Taft page. I wanted to bring up the point, just to correct the professor, that Taft had two summer capitals, and they were actually located in Beverly Cove, not Beverly Farms, which is another section. And it was kind of convenient. A lot of movers and shakers living down there. He had a small little summer cottage, about 16 rooms, and he was staying with the Evanses. And Mrs. Evans, his husband, was the president of U.S. Rubber, but Mrs. Evans was not prone to the kind of attention that Mr. Taft brought to the area. And there were people actually tearing shingles off the home and the like. And she was so distressed that after 2 seasons, she requested the president find new lodgings, which he did in another section of Beverly, in a building called Parramatta. But she actually cut the home in half and floated it across the harbor to Marblehead and reassembled it over on Peaches Point and then put it in a beautiful Italian garden. There are no, the house doesn't exist anymore in Marblehead, it's since burned. But she did, after that, the land did end up coming to the city of Beverly, and it's now Lynch Park.
Now, how often would the Tafts come to Beverly?
Well, actually, Nellie was scouting for a place a few weeks after the president was inaugurated. They had stayed, I guess, 16 years up in Saginaw, Murray Bay, and it wasn't thought appropriate that the president be out of the country now that he was president. And so she scouted around, and they had some good friends. The Hammonds were very close friends of the president and then his wife. And so they were looking for something down in this neck of the woods, and they settled in Beverly, which at the time only had about 18,000 people living here.
I don't know if we have it, but there's a plate here up on the second floor that Ray Henderson had a little bit earlier. We might be able to show that actually has, I think, a picture of their home. They would go there every summer, Professor?
Apparently, yes, yes.
Anything else from Beverly, Massachusetts?
Yeah,
there we can show it.
That would be their first home, the one that's located, was Stetson College. It's built by Mr. Stetson of Stetson Hat fame. And it was that was the one that was cut in half and floated across the bay. And now there exists an Italian garden in that location.
People can come visit there?
I'm sorry?
Can people come visit there?
Well, yes, it's a public park. It is open to everyone. They charge you to park if you don't have a sticker, if you're not from Beverly, but you can walk into it, I'm sure.
Thanks. Corpus Christi, Texas, you're next. Good morning, Corpus Christi. One more time, Corpus Christi. We lost Corpus Christi. Mr. Taft, we're going to let you go in just a few moments. When does the complete Taft family get together very often?
There are family gatherings. Certainly, the large Taft family, of course, is based in New England. We're just an offshoot, the Ohio offshoot, and there, I believe, are hundreds of Tafts get together up in Massachusetts on an annual basis or close to it. The Ohio group is a little bit less efficient, I guess, than that. We get together on family occasions, but we haven't actually had as many reunions as we probably should.
We were told that in William Howard Taft's generation that the family was very important in the final decisions of whether someone would run for a political office. Is that still true today?
I think in the sense of the immediate family of the person involved, that would be true. We believe in family, and I think anybody who was considering running for office would check with the people who would be affected, their wife and children and parents, if that were part of it. But as to it's a much larger family now, and I don't think people check with their second and third cousins very much. But we're a bit of a clan, and I think we enjoy each other, and when we do get together, that's we talk about the normal things that families talk about.
William Howard Taft IV is a law partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Freed, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, joining us this morning from in front of the White House. We thank you for your time, sir.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on.
Appreciate it. We're now going to bring you back to Cincinnati. Cincinnati is in this home that you're going to see on your screen in just a moment, was the home and birthplace of our 27th President of the United States. Is the president that we're talking about this week. He was born in this house in 1857. And Professor Burton, as we continue in this, the inauguration day of 1909, President Taft is taking office. What's the weather like?
It's inclement.
Is that a nice way to say it?
A heavy snowstorm, which disrupted the ceremony to some degree. It had to be held inside rather than outside. But the point is that despite the weather, he became the 27th president. And he's often quoted to the effect I've told people all along it would be a cold day when I was elected president, or inaugurated in this case, inaugurated president of the United States. And I think that reveals the kind of humorous approach he could take to something as inconveniencing as a snowstorm.
And that's what it looked like on that day. There's a picture from one of the exhibits here in this house. Apex, North Carolina, you're next. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I want to add that I really like this series myself. My question is my wife is a Filipina, and I visited the Philippines several times, so I have a large interest towards the Philippines. My questions are, number one, what did President Taft most enjoy and least like about the Philippines? Did President Taft push for the Philippines to become a state? And also, I was curious, have any of the other Tafts and descendants visited the Philippines since the president's death? And is anyone aware that the largest street in Manila is named after the president, Taft Avenue?
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you for that series of questions. The weather was the worst part of his time there. That's what he disliked the most. What he liked the most is equally simple to answer. He liked the people the most. He found them a gracious people. He found them a friendly people. He found them a warm people and an appreciative people. Insofar as statehood is concerned, no, he did not think in terms of statehood. He thought in terms of eventual Filipino independence. And I don't think that Taft would have put a date on that, quite frankly, but one could speculate and say a generation of Filipino people ruling themselves, as you undoubtedly know because of your familiarity with the Philippines. The first all-Filipino Congress met in 1907. By this time, Taft was back in Washington at the War Department. But this was the coming together of representatives from all over the archipelago to meet for the first time as Filipinos. And it was from that kind of meeting that he hoped things would grow in the direction not of statehood, but of nationhood. I think we can say that he saw the Filipino people as tending toward nationhood rather than statehood. And maybe he was thinking simply in terms of logistics. After all, it's 9,000 miles away. Would it be practical from what we knew of transportation and communication at that time to have it as a state? But I get back to my main point. Statehood, yes. Statehood, no. Nationhood, yes.
There were two new states that came into the Union during the Taft administration.
Oh, yes.
New Mexico and Arizona, is that correct?
He kept Arizona at territorial level until they agreed to change their constitution to eliminate the recall of judges as one of the constitutional principles of the territory of Arizona as it sought to become a state. And when they deleted that from the Constitution, they came into the Union, and the first meeting of the Arizona state legislature reinstated the recall of judges as one of the principles of law in Arizona.
We are in the parlor of the Taft House. It's located in the Mount Auburn area of Cincinnati. Population today, 400,000. Population back when the president was born here, 150,000. You'll see it on your screen in just a few moments, and we're going to be taking you upstairs now and having you rejoin Ray Henderson, who is up there. One of the things we're going to talk about next is the presidency, the president celebrating a personal anniversary while he was in the White House. That's his 25th wedding anniversary. I think we have a photo there of the 25th wedding anniversary. We can show our viewers, which was there it is, right there. A little family photo that was taken, and Ray Henderson is joining us with some of the artifacts from that period. Was it a big celebration, Mr. Henderson?
Yeah, it was a great celebration, and it was, you know, one of the tragedies of Nellie Taft's becoming First Lady was that she suffered a stroke in her first year, and she wasn't able to enjoy it as much as she would. But her 25th wedding anniversary was celebrated there, and it was a joyous occasion. 5,000 people, they had bands playing, colored lights, and they were just overwhelmed with gifts of silver. A lot of silver was given to them. This piece here is one of the 25th wedding anniversary gifts, and so it was a joyous occasion. Now it's interesting, they received all the silver, and it was sort of embarrassing, but Mrs. Taft liked to take some of the silver and have it re-engraved and give it as gifts after that. But it was one of those times that she really enjoyed in the White House. William Howard Taft had a great time. In fact, he kept the band playing and things going on until about 1 in the morning. And they were so overjoyed that they let the band continue to play the next day and open it up to the public.
How long was she not in residence at the White House due to her health?
Well, on and off. During her first year, during the first year, I believe she suffered the stroke in May. And for a few months, she was not able to uphold her duties. In fact, I think the first night that she suffered her stroke, they didn't announce it, and her sister took care of some of her duties. Her daughter came into the White House and helped with some of her duties, and her sisters also. She would continue to have some relapses. In fact, she had a relapse shortly before the 25th wedding anniversary, but she spent most of her time there at the White House.
The audio, now that we've gotten into this era where audio is possible, how was it done?
Well, we have several different methods, actually a couple. We have some Edison wax cylinders. We have a few of these in our collection. This is one from William Howard Taft, and these could be maybe a 2-minute or 4-minute in length, just depending upon the speed. They were a little bit soft, but if you had an Edison player, then you could play your wax recording. We also have some 78 RPM, some regular records that have some of William Howard Taft's speeches that we use in some of our presentations.
If you missed it earlier, here's a little bit of what he sounded like during the 1908 campaign.
The Republican Party has pursued consistently the policy originally adopted with respect to the dependencies which came to us as the result of the Spanish War. The material prosperity of Puerto Rico and the progress of its inhabitants towards better conditions in respect to comfort of living and education should make every American proud that this nation has been an efficient instrument in bringing happiness to 1 million people.
How much audio do you have of William Howard Taft, Mr. Henderson?
Well, we have one program that we use for the public that comes in to visit the site. We also have about 78 RPM records, and we have about 3 of these wax cylinders. In fact, I have to return a call of someone who called last week wanting to donate some more of these recordings of William Howard Taft.
Back to the phones for our 2 guests. Big Spring, Texas is next. Good morning.
Hello, I'm Craig Fisher, assistant principal in the Big Spring High School here in West Texas, and
welcome.
I love the C-SPAN program. I'll be looking for you all to come to Denison to see Eisenhower's birthplace later, and also Stonewall, Texas, for LBJ's birthplace when you cover those presidencies. But my brother was married at Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, about 2 weeks ago at a chapel called the Gift Chapel, which the citizens of San Antonio raised $50,000 to have a chapel back in 1909, and that chapel was dedicated by William Howard Taft. There's a big block of granite which bears the inscription dedicated by William Howard Taft, President of the United States, October 17th, 1909. That'd be right after his inauguration, I guess. And he came with the Secretary of War, Jacob W. Dickinson, at that time. And this chapel has about 22 stained glass windows. One commemorates the Union veterans of the Civil War, which is unusual here in Texas. And also on the right is the synagogue for the Jewish worship, and to the left, a Catholic altar for the Catholic worship. And of course, my brother is married in the Protestant chapel, which is lined, by the way, with all the 50 states flags and District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Island flags. Very beautiful chapel, and I thought that might make another connection with Taft here in Texas. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt did organize Rough Riders at the Menger Hotel in Texas too, San Antonio, right there. Maybe that's why Taft was visiting. I don't know.
Thanks, Big Spring. Appreciate the call. Mr. Henderson, we've talked, several callers now have asked about the connection between the Taft family and different areas in Texas. Can you help us out with that at all?
Well, the trip that he was probably talking about was on the same trip that he took when he met with President Diaz in Mexico. That was in October of 1909. Charlie Taft, there was a question earlier about Charlie Taft and David Sinton. They did own a ranch in Texas, a rather large ranch, and William Howard Taft actually visited Taft, Texas, where that area was named, and we have photographs of him down there on the Taft Ranch. So I couldn't remember exactly what his connection was, but it was Charlie Taft, the president's brother, who co-owned that ranch down in Texas.
We want to spend some of our last 10 minutes taking a look at the Supreme Court and the Taft presidency. So, Mr. Henderson, we're going to ask you to go over to that period. We'd also tell our viewers that C-SPAN in the classroom is a way in which teachers can get involved with this whole American President series. Here's how you can do it. Dial 202-626-4858 if you're a teacher, and you can go ahead and find out. Today, we would just ask you if you could just leave a message, and somebody will call you back tomorrow. It's due to the holiday. If you'd prefer, you can go to our website at cspan.org/classroom. Now, Mr. Henderson, I understand that you also have some lesson plans that you work on for the students here in Cincinnati?
Yes, we have a lesson plan that we use here at the site. It's currently on a website, and I can't give you that exact address, but if they set their search engine for teaching with historic places, it will connect them with the lesson plan that we use here at William Howard Taft National Historic Site.
Great, and we also mentioned to you that we have a website specifically for our American Presidents series. It is www.americanpresidents.org. You can go to that. You can find out where we've been and where we're going next week. Woodrow Wilson. Corpus Christi, Texas, your next caller. Good morning.
Morning. My goodness, you got a contingent from Texas, don't you, out there calling
Yes,
in
we
today?
do.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on something that he just recently, your guest, touched on, and that was what I thought was pretty important, which was the inauguration of 2 new states. And I wanted to see how that interfaced with their campaigning politics, what their planning was, if they had any in terms of those 2 states, and get an idea of whether they fit into any kind of a party plan or in some way with the politics that was going on in the eastern parts of the country.
Thanks, Professor Burton.
Yes, well, of course, Taft, as I mentioned in passing, was very aware of the, what shall we say, the fringe thinking of people in the West. Taft, although he was from Ohio, was in many ways an unreconstructed New Englander, and therefore the West was much freer, much more open to innovation and change, such as the recall of judges and referendum and plebiscites. So I would have thought that Taft personally would have been wary of the new ideas coming in from the West, in contrast to a man like Roosevelt, who would have been welcoming in that respect. So very probably Taft downplayed the importance of the territories becoming states, whereas, and I'm not sure what Wilson's position on this would be, Roosevelt being an adapted Westerner, after all, his ranch in the Dakotas and the Rough Riders at San Antonio and speeches in Colorado and on the West Coast. In 1911, he said, well, Congress debated, I took Panama. That's what he said to the people in California. So he would have been more open to that. But given the fact that they would have very few electoral votes, I don't suppose that they were thought of in a calculating way by either party or by either candidate.
Ray Henderson, can you show us what the Taft court looked like at the Supreme Court? What the members looked like?
Right here you have the Supreme Court that Taft served on in 1924.
I see there are a couple familiar faces, Professor. I see Louis Brandeis.
Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., of course.
That's in the front, and that's in the front row right there.
That's right. And the second gentleman from the left, Joseph McKenna, is a graduate of St. Joseph's College in Philadelphia. So we have a McKenna portrait in our library.
How happy was William Howard Taft at this period of time in his life?
He was the happiest of all his public duties. He wrote most of the decisions. He compromised the differences between the hardliners on the right and the hardliners on the left. I put it this way. William Howard Taft, in retrospect, cherished the presidency. But to be on the court was to sit with the gods. He felt himself sitting with the gods. He was happy.
Ray Henderson, how long did he serve as Chief Justice before his health started to fail?
Well, he had his health started failing him a few years before he resigned in 1930. He had heart problems in the 1920s. And in February, he resigned. His son, Robert, actually did the resignation for him, and he died on March the 8th, 1930.
So he resigned, Professor, just on, what, a month or so before his death?
Yes, he did. But I think much of the work of the court he had shifted because he was a good administrator and because he said, I am not going to put myself first. The most important thing is for the work of the court to be done in an efficient and forthright and fair-minded way. And therefore, he moved much of the work to the younger members of the court toward the close. But he was much loved by the court, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Wrote this message when he retired that though you are gone from us in body, you will be always with us in spirit. How much we loved you, how much we revered you in terms of your leadership.
We have some video of him being helped in some of his final days there. We'll take a look at that as we take a call from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. You're next. Good morning.
Good morning. This is really a great series of programs you're airing. Please keep up the good work.
Thanks.
And I have a couple of questions. I hope either Professor Burton or the gentleman who's been taking us through the memorial there can answer. What was the exact or approximate weight that President Taft attained while he was in the White House? And also, just what exactly precipitated the rift between him and President Roosevelt? Thank you. I'll wait for your answers.
Mr. Henderson, do you want to take the weight question?
Well, we generally say he weighed about 335 pounds. I've heard people say he was up to 350 pounds, but we generally talk about 335.
And how tall was he?
6 foot. I've seen a lot of weights, but we have an insurance policy from 1900 that lists his height as 5'11 and a half, so I consider him about 6 foot.
Professor, you talked a little bit earlier about the rift between he and TR.
Yes, I did.
You want to talk?
And I'll say just a bit more on that. It was a serious rift. It was a rift of disappointment on Roosevelt's. For example, Taft had intimated, without promising, that maybe I will keep all of your cabinet when I become president. He didn't keep all of the cabinet at all. He brought his own people in. And rightly so. It was going to be a Taft presidency. And maybe that's the key to the many things that happened which accumulated. Taft wanted the presidency to be his presidency. I've been kicked around too many times, he's quoted as saying. Now I am in charge. And this may have come as a revelation to Roosevelt, I don't know. But Roosevelt was unrealistic to think that new issues, new personalities, new problems would not arise over the course of 4 years. And therefore, he was just expecting too much of Taft to... We heard this before when President Taft heard someone say, Mr. President, he would look around to see if Roosevelt was there. Well, that may have been a kind of conditioned reflex of his neck or his body or his head, but he knew that William Howard Taft was president, and maybe Theodore Roosevelt, with all his enthusiasm for power, found that hard to handle.
As Mr. Henderson said earlier, the president died on March, was it 30th again? March 8th, 1930. And we have some video of his funeral we can show you as we take another call from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Hello.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my call. I have a book in front of me called Know Your Presidents and Their Wives that was published in 1960. My mother got it for me when I was a child. And in reference to music and the Taft family, it says in this book here that Helen was an accomplished pianist, and in later years she founded the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. It also goes on to say that she enjoyed social affairs and entertainments, and because of her interest in music, often invited leading musicians and singers to the White House as guests. Thank you very much for taking my call.
Well, thank you, and as always, we love it when our callers can bring us the answers to questions we didn't know. Mr. Henderson, can you help us at all, also expanding on that music question?
Yes, she did help to found the Cincinnati Symphony. The Tafts were very much involved in the arts, especially Nellie and her sister-in-law, Mrs. Charles P. Taft, Annie Sinton Taft. The question was asked about the piano downstairs. Mrs. Louise Taft, William Howard Taft's mother, did play and teach piano. The piano was a big part of their entertainment. A lot of times when they were having social engagements, the piano was being played, but they were very big supporters of the arts.
Howell, Wyoming, you're next. Howell, are you there? We have some, go ahead.
Good morning, and how are you doing?
Fine, thanks.
I have a three-part question, and I'm sorry if these are repeats, but I just now turned you on.
Sure.
What was President Taft's greatest achievements, and was there any landmark Supreme Court decisions that were brought down during his reign on the court? And is C-SPAN going to do anything on the presidential wives? And thank you. I'll hang up and listen for your answer.
Thanks. I just tell you, in terms of the presidential wives, we try to talk about them every time we talk about one of the presidents, so we get a little bit of it within that. The biggest case in the Supreme Court?
This was talked about before, but I'm going to add to it now. I said it was the Myers versus the United States case because this Taft, as a former president, realized that presidents had to be able to dismiss subordinates in his chain of command approach to administration. And he upheld the dismissal of this postmaster by the president because he thought the president had the power to do so. About the same time, there was a case called Ex parte Grossman, argued in 1924 and settled in 1926, in which he defended the power of the pardon, of the power of the president to deliver presidential pardons. Apparently, a federal district court judge attempted to jail a man that the president had already pardoned because he said your only punishment is to pay a fee, and I'm going to give you a presidential pardon. And this particular judge tried to clamp Grossman into jail, and in Ex parte Grossman, the Taft court, with the president writing the opinion, said, under no circumstances, the president does have the power to pardon, full stop.
President Taft was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, as we mentioned before. We have a little bit of video of that. He is one of two presidents buried at Arlington, the other being John F. Kennedy. And Mr. Henderson, am I correct? I understand that Mr. Taft's, the President Taft's funeral was the first one to be broadcast on radio.
Yes, it was broadcast both here in the United States and I believe someplace overseas, but it was an interesting funeral. President Taft was brought down from his home. He was carried past the White House to the Capitol, where he lay in state for from about 10:30 till noon. And 7,000 to 9,000 people passed by to see him. And at noon, he was taken to All Saints Church, Unitarian Church. There was no eulogy. There were a few songs sang. And then he was taken out to Arlington at about 3:15, I believe, was a burial at Arlington National Cemetery.
Bloomfield, New Jersey, last call. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I really enjoy this show, and I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate on the public lands debate during Taft's presidency, the conservation versus the selling of public lands, the circumstances surrounding the resignation of Ballinger, and the role of Taft.
Professor.
Well, it's one of the big controversies and one that perhaps broke open the Taft-Roosevelt relationship. Taft backed up his Interior Secretary Ballinger because Ballinger said that under no circumstances was the Interior Department to release lands to the Guggenheim Group for the exploitation of their natural resources. but a man by the name of Louis Glubus, who worked in the government, fed information to the opponents of Ballinger, particularly Gifford Pinchot, that they had struck a deal. And of course, this blew up in Taft's face, because Taft believed in chain of command administration, and he backed up Ballinger rather than a lower ranking officer, Pinchot. But I want to add to that by saying that during his time in office, Taft, working through the Congress, which he thought was the appropriate thing to do, rather than to put land outside of the exploitation of private interests by executive decree, working through the Congress, the Taft administration put millions of acres of western land under the protection of the federal government, at least for an extended period of time. I think that Taft has gotten a rather bad press on his attitude toward conservation. His attitude was positive, but it was not the kind of executive free-swinging style that Theodore Roosevelt made so famous and perhaps so unfortunate.
Our thanks to the Time Warner Cable folks, especially Krista Pilley, who helped us at this stop. Ray Henderson, thanks to you and the staff here at the National Park Service for giving us all your hospitality. Tell our viewers again when they can visit you.
We're open 10 to 4. We're only closed Thanksgiving, Christmas days, and New Year's Day.
And it's free?
It is free.
And you have a little bookshop here too?
Yes, we have a little bookshop that sells Dr. Burton's books, 2 of his books, and we're also moving into an education center next door sometime this fall.
And where could people call if they want to know more about your lesson plans for teachers in schools?
They can call the site here at area code 513-684-3262, and they can check their search engines for teaching with historic places, and they can link up to a lesson plan that's on that website.
And again, thanks to the superintendent here too, Kurt Topham, who helped us. Professor, what did we miss about William Howard Taft?
We have not missed anything, but there's a great deal more to say. So those books are out there, folks. Read them. Thank you.
Next, thank you very much for joining us. Next stop, Woodrow Wilson will be in Stanton, Virginia 1 week from today. Thanks for joining us. We've been live in Cincinnati, Ohio at the birthplace of William Howard Taft, our 27th president.